The dry heat of the Texas Panhandle usually felt like a homecoming hug, but as I turned my dusty dually truck onto Bluebonnet Lane, it felt more like a fever dream. I had been gone for 14 months, operation enduring freedom, a blur of sand, static-filled radio calls, and the constant, low-humming ache for the smell of hay and cedar. I had inherited the Double M ranch from my grandfather. It was 60 acres of stubborn land that sat just on the edge of a rapidly expanding suburban sprawl. When I left, my neighbor Elias promised to watch the place. When I returned, the first thing I noticed wasn't the overgrown grass or the chipped paint on the fence. It was the absence of the silhouette that had defined my childhood. The barn was gone. The 1920s timber frame structure, a cathedral of weathered oak and memories where I'd learned to shear sheep and fix engines, was a flat, gravel-covered scar on the earth. In its place stood a small, plastic-looking sign on a wooden stake: property in violation of HOA Covenant 4.2, structure removed for public safety. My blood didn't boil, it turned to ice. My ranch wasn't part of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It was an enclave, an island of history they had built their stucco shingle empire around, or so I thought. The paper trail of betrayal. I didn't even unpack my sea bag. I drove straight to the Whispering Pines Community Center. I was still in my desert utilities, the salt stains from a final hike in Djibouti still etched into the fabric. I looked like a ghost from a war zone, which in a way I was. Inside the air-conditioned lobby, a woman named Brenda sat behind a desk. She looked at my uniform, then at my face, and her practiced smile faltered. "Can I help you, Sergeant?" "Weston Miller," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "I own the Double M, where is my barn?" Brenda's eyes darted to a side office. A man in a crisp polo shirt stepped out. This was Marcus Thorne, the HOA president, a man who looked like he spent more on hair gel than I did on cattle feed. "Sergeant Miller, welcome home," Marcus said, extending a hand I didn't take. "We sent several notices. Your property was annexed into the Whispering Pines district 18 months ago through a municipal zoning shift. Since the barn was deemed structurally unsound and a visual blight by our architectural committee, we exercised our right to remediate the hazard while you were away." "Remediate?" I stepped closer. "You tore down a historical landmark because it didn't match your cookie-cutter aesthetic. I have the deed. I never signed into an HOA." "The city council voted on the annexation 3 weeks after you deployed," Marcus said, his tone shifting to a patronizing smoothness. "Legally, you were represented by a court-appointed curator since you were unreachable. Everything was handled by the book." I felt a roar in my ears. I had fought for people's right to be safe, only to come home and find my own history had been remediated by a man in a polo shirt. The counter-offensive. I spent the next 48 hours with a lawyer named Sealers, an old friend of my father's who smelled like menthol and old books. We sat in his dim office, surrounded by stacks of paper. "They used a loophole, Wheeze," Sealers sighed, rubbing his temples. "The Service Members Civil Relief Act, SCRA, is supposed to protect you from civil actions while on active duty. They claimed they couldn't find your deployment orders, which is a lie because Elias gave them a copy. They pushed the annexation through a blind committee." "What can we do?" I asked. Sealers grinned, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. They made one massive mistake. In their haste to tear it down, they violated the very bylaws they used to annex you. According to the Whispering Pines Charter, any remediated structure on a property zoned for agricultural use must be restored to its original state if the removal is found to be in violation of the SCI. And Marcus Thorne signed the demolition order himself, personally certifying that the property was abandoned. "You weren't abandoned, Wheeze. You were on a government-mandated business trip." "We didn't just sue. We filed for an emergency injunction and a motion for total restitution." The breaking point. The confrontation happened at the monthly HOA meeting. The room was packed with neighbors, people I had known for years and newcomers who looked at my ranch as an eyesore. Marcus stood at the podium, explaining the new uniform mailbox initiative. I walked in the back door, Sealers trailing behind me with a briefcase that looked like a weapon. "Marcus," I called out. The room went silent. "I'm not here about mailboxes." "Sergeant, this is a private meeting," Marcus snapped. "Actually, according to the papers you served me, I'm a member of this association," I said, walking down the center aisle. I laid a thick folder on his podium. "And as a member, I'm notifying you that the federal court has issued a summary judgment. You violated the SCI. You destroyed a protected structure on a veteran's property while he was in a combat zone." The murmurs in the room grew into a dull roar. Sealers stepped up. "The court hasn't just fined the HOA, they've ordered a specific performance. You have 90 days to rebuild the double M barn, not a metal shed, not a plastic garage. A timber frame, mortise and tenon oak barn, built to the exact specifications of the 1920 blueprints on file with the county. Marcus turned pale. That will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The association's insurance won't cover an illegal demolition. Then I suggest you start a bake sale, I said, because the first truck of oak arrives tomorrow morning. The rebuilding. The next 3 months were a spectacle. The HOA was forced to divert the entire landscaping and beautification fund to my ranch. The irony was delicious. The very people who had voted to tear my barn down to save their property values were now watching their monthly dues go toward the most expensive construction project in the county. I spent my days on the porch, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the cranes. They had to hire specialist carpenters from 2 states away. These weren't the speed-build contractors who threw up the neighborhood's McMansions in a weekend. These were craftsmen. Marcus Thorne was there every day, looking increasingly haggard. He had to personally oversee the site to ensure the HOA wasn't being overcharged. "You're ruining this community, Miller," Marcus hissed one afternoon as a load of reclaimed heart pine was delivered. "People are selling their houses because the special assessment fees are so high." "I didn't ruin it, Marcus," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You did when you decided that your vision was more important than the truth. You thought I was just a number on a deployment list. You thought I wouldn't come back to check the math." As the weeks passed, something strange happened. The neighbors, the ones who weren't Marcus, started coming over. Mrs. Gable, who lived in the cul-de-sac bordering my north pasture, brought over a plate of cookies. "My grandfather had a barn like this," she whispered, looking at the massive oak beams being hoisted into place. "I hated when they tore yours down. I was just too scared of Marcus to say anything." Slowly, the Whispering Pines facade began to crack. People started asking me about my time overseas. They started asking about the history of the ranch. The barn wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol of something they had lost when they moved into a neighborhood with 1,000 rules and no soul. The final peg. The climax of the project came on a Saturday in late autumn. The skeleton of the barn was complete. It was a masterpiece of joinery, heavy, honest, and smelling of sawdust and sweat. The final king peg had to be driven into the main trestle. Traditionally, this was the owner's job. The entire HOA board was there, along with half the neighborhood. Marcus stood to the side, looking like a man who had lost a war he hadn't realized he was fighting. I climbed the scaffolding. The height gave me a view of the whole valley. I could see the neat, grey roofs of the HOA, and beyond them, the wild, rolling hills of the Texas Breaks. I held the wooden mallet. I looked down at Marcus. "This barn stood for 100 years before you got here," I shouted so everyone could hear. "It'll stand for 100 more after we're all gone. Rules are meant to protect people, not to erase them." I swung the mallet. The sound of wood hitting wood echoed across the valley, a solid, final thwack. The barn was whole again. HOA unfolded. In the months that followed, the HOA leadership was completely overhauled. Marcus Thorne resigned and moved away, unable to handle the disgrace of the special assessments. The new board, led by Mrs. Gable, voted to de-annex the Double M Ranch, returning it to its original status as independent agricultural land. The barn stood taller and stronger than the one I had left behind. It was a strange mix of the old and the new, reclaimed wood held together by modern justice. I sat on the tailgate of my truck one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the new oak a deep, burnt orange. My deployment had taught me about the fragility of peace, but my return had taught me about the resilience of home. The HOA had tried to fold my history into their brochure, to tuck it away where it wouldn't disturb the view. But history has a way of unfolding itself. It's heavy, it's stubborn, and if you try to bury it, it only grows deeper roots. I opened the massive double doors of the barn. The air inside was cool and still. I took a deep breath of the cedar scent. I was home, and for the first time since I'd stepped off the plane, the world felt like it was exactly the right shape. The Double M wasn't just a ranch anymore. It was a monument to the fact that sometimes, to find your place in the world, you have to be willing to tear down the fences people build around you, and make them help you build something better in their place.